didn't leave my house because I was lonely, and that's the part most people get wrong when they hear a story like mine, because loneliness is something you can learn to live with over time, something that softens around the edges if you let it, something that becomes part of your routine in a quiet, manageable way. But what I couldn't live with, what I couldn't quiet down no matter how hard I tried, was the slow, growing feeling that I could no longer trust myself. I didn't leave my house because I was lonely, and that's the part most people get wrong when they hear a story like mine. Because loneliness is something you can learn to live with over time, something that softens around the edges if you let it, something that becomes part of your routine in a quiet, manageable way. But what I couldn't live with, what I couldn't quiet down no matter how hard I tried, was the slow, growing feeling that I could no longer trust myself. I had been living alone for 5 years after my husband passed away, and those 5 years were not as empty as people imagine. They weren't filled with constant sadness or unbearable silence. They were simply different. Quieter in a way that took time to understand, slower in a way that forced me to notice things I had never paid attention to before, like the way sunlight moves across the same wall throughout the day, or how a house has its own rhythm when there are no other voices inside it. I built a life in that quiet, a simple one, but one that belonged entirely to me, where my mornings were slow and unhurried, where I could sit by the window with my tea and watch the same street I had watched for decades, where the familiarity of everything around me made me feel anchored, even when everything else had changed. But over time, something shifted. Not suddenly, not in a way I could point to and say, this is when it started, but gradually, almost invisibly, through small moments that didn't seem important on their own, moments that most people would ignore without a second thought. I would walk into a room and forget why I was there. Not completely, not in a way that frightened me at first. Just a pause, a brief moment where my mind went quiet before catching up again. And for a while I told myself that was normal, that everyone forgets things sometimes, that it didn't mean anything. But then I started noticing other things, small details I had never questioned before, like checking whether I had turned the stove off, and then checking again, even when I knew I had already done it. Or standing at the front door after locking it and still feeling the need to test the handle, just to be sure, not because I had any real reason to doubt myself, but because the doubt had already taken root. And that is how it happens, not as fear of the world around you, but as fear of your own certainty. A quiet erosion of confidence that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand attention, but slowly begins to change the way you move, the way you think, the way you exist inside your own life. At night, it became harder to ignore because there are fewer distractions in the dark. fewer things to pull your attention away from your thoughts, and I would lie in bed replaying the day over and over again, asking myself questions that didn't have answers, wondering if I had missed something important, wondering if next time I wouldn't notice at all. One evening I burned a pot of soup, and it wasn't anything serious, nothing that couldn't be cleaned and forgotten in a few minutes. But I didn't react the way I used to. I didn't laugh it off or move on. Instead, I stood there staring at it, feeling something I couldn't quite explain, because my first thought wasn't, that happens. It was, what if I hadn't caught it in time? That was the moment I realized something had changed, not in my abilities, but in my belief in those abilities. And that distinction matters more than people think, because when you stop trusting yourself in small things, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads quietly into everything else. My children noticed something was different. Not the details, not the specific moments, but the feeling, the hesitation in my voice, the way I answered their questions just a little more slowly than before. And they began to say things out of concern, out of love, telling me to be careful, telling me I didn't have to do everything on my own anymore. And they weren't wrong. That's what made it harder, because their concern was real, their intentions were good. But what they didn't understand was that I wasn't struggling because I couldn't do things. I was struggling because I had started to believe that I couldn't. And once that belief takes hold, everything feels heavier than it should. I didn't tell them the truth because the truth sounded worse out loud than it did in my own head. And saying, I don't trust myself anymore, felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. So instead I said what people always say, I'm fine, even when I knew I wasn't. And slowly, without any dramatic moment, without any single event that forced the decision, that quiet doubt turned into something else. Something that felt like logic, like responsibility, like planning for the future instead of reacting to fear. I told myself that maybe I needed help. Not because I truly needed it, but because I was tired of questioning everything I did. Tired of second-guessing simple actions. Tired of living with that constant low-level uncertainty that never fully went away. So when the idea came up, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like relief waiting to happen. The place itself was exactly what you would expect. Clean, organized, structured in a way that made everything predictable, where every part of the day had a place and a purpose, where nothing was left uncertain. And in the beginning, that predictability felt comforting, because for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to question myself. I didn't have to check things twice. I didn't have to wonder if I had forgotten something important, because everything was already being handled. That relief was real, I won't pretend it wasn't. But what I didn't understand at the time was that relief and happiness are not the same thing. And what feels like a solution in the short term can become something else entirely if you're not paying attention. Because when everything is handled for you, when every decision is made before you even think to ask the question, you slowly stop making decisions for yourself. And it doesn't feel like something is being taken away. It feels like something is being simplified. But simplicity has a cost. At first it was small things, being told when to eat, when to rest, when to take medication. Things that seemed helpful, practical even. And I followed along because it made sense, because it was easier, because it removed the burden of choice. But over time, those small things added up. And one morning I woke up and realized something that unsettled me more than anything I had felt in my own home. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Not because I didn't have options, but because I hadn't made a decision in so long that the idea of choosing something for myself felt unfamiliar. That was the moment I understood what I had given up. Not my safety. Not my comfort, myself. I had traded uncertainty for control, and in doing so, I had removed the very thing that made my life mine. And once you see that clearly, you can't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I didn't overthink it. I didn't wait for permission or approval. I simply got dressed, put on my shoes, and walked out. Because sometimes the most important decisions are the quiet ones, the ones you make without explaining them to anyone else. No one stopped me, because the door had never been locked. I had just convinced myself that it was. When I stepped outside, nothing about the world had changed. It wasn't safer. It wasn't easier. But it felt real in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Because for the first time in weeks, I had made a decision that belonged to me. When I returned home, everything was the same as I had left it. The silence, the risks, the uncertainty. But it didn't feel the same anymore, because now I understood something I wish I had understood sooner. Confidence doesn't come back by avoiding decisions. It comes back by making them, even small ones, even imperfect ones, even ones that carry a little risk. I still forget things sometimes. I still double-check the stove. I still move more carefully than I used to. But that isn't failure. That's life, and I would rather live with that reality than slowly disappear inside a life where nothing belongs to me anymore. When I stepped outside, nothing about the world had changed. It wasn't safer. It wasn't easier. But it felt real in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Because for the first time in weeks, I had made a decision that belonged to me. When I returned home, everything was the same as I had left it. The silence, the risks, the uncertainty. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Because now I understood something I wish I had understood sooner. Confidence doesn't come back by avoiding decisions. It comes back by making them, even small ones, even imperfect ones, even ones that carry a little risk. I still forget things sometimes. I still double-check the stove. I still move more carefully than I used to. But that isn't failure, that's life. And I would rather live with that reality than slowly disappear inside a life where nothing belongs to me anymore.